every year, with seemingly little regard for the strategic picture facing our country, this body, House and the Senate, vote to increase the military budget. Just happens. We don't worry about people sleeping out on the street. We don't worry about people who don't have any health care. We don't worry about people who can't afford prescriptions. Every year, military budget, hey, more money. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are over, and tens of thousands of American troops have returned home, yet the Pentagon's budget continues to go up. We have year after year given the Pentagon more money than they have even requested, requiring them to submit, quote unquote, wish lists of items to Congress. In other words, tell us what more you need. The Pentagon is routinely given so much taxpayer money that it literally doesn't know what to do with all the money Congress has thrown at them. Every year, despite partisan, sometimes very contentious, partisan fights on all manners of things, you name it, big fights going on, Congress somehow comes together very quietly, little debate, to vote for the one thing that they agree on, and that is more and more money for the Pentagon. And right now, despite all of the enormous needs facing working families in this country, over half of the federal discretionary budget goes to the military. Got it? Over half of the federal discretionary budget goes to the military. Madam President, I support a strong military. People don't have to convince me why we need a strong military. But I will oppose this legislation, this defense authorization bill, for four major reasons. First, more military spending right now is unnecessary. The United States remains the world's dominant military power and is in no danger of losing that position. Alone, we account for roughly 40% of global military spending. This comes despite the end of the war in Afghanistan and despite the fact that the United States now spends more on the military than the next 10 countries combined, most of whom are our allies. We spend more than the next 10 countries combined, most of whom are our allies. Last year, we spent more than 3 times what China is spending on the military and more than 10 times what Russia spent. And while this year's Defense Authorization Act would merely match the Pentagon's record-breaking request, in most recent years, Congress has seen fit to give the Department of Defense more money than it even asked for. Imagine that. According to the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, over an 11-year period, the Pentagon returned an astonishing $128 billion in excess funds to the Treasury. In other words, we gave them so much money, they couldn't even spend it, and they had to return some of that. So that's reason number one why I oppose this legislation. Number two, the Pentagon cannot keep track of the dollars it already has, leading to massive waste, fraud, and abuse in the sprawling military-industrial complex. The Pentagon accounts for about 2/3 of all federal contracting activity, obligating more money every year than all civilian federal agencies combined. Yet the Department of Defense remains the only major federal agency that cannot pass an independent audit, more than 30 years after Congress required them to do so. So we're throwing hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars into the Pentagon. 30 years ago, Congress said, we want an audit. We want to know what's going on, a reasonable request. It's only been 30 years. We still have not gotten an independent audit. Madam President, last year, the Department of Defense was unable to account for over half of its assets, which are in excess of $3 trillion, or roughly 78% of what the entire federal government owns. The Government Accountability Office, GAO, reports that the Department of Defense still cannot accurately track its finances or capture and post transactions to the current accounts. Much of this additional military spending will go to line the pockets of hugely profitable defense contractors. It is corporate welfare by a different name. Almost half of the Pentagon budget goes to private contractors, some of whom are exploiting their monopoly positions and the trust granted them by the United States to line their pockets. Repeated investigations by the DoD Inspector General, the GAO, and CBS News have uncovered numerous instances of contractors massively overcharging the Department of Defense, helping boost these companies' profits to nearly 40%. Profit margins to nearly 40%, and sometimes as high as over 4,000%, while costing U.S. taxpayers hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. TransDigm, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon are among the offenders, dramatically overcharging taxpayers while reaping enormous profits, seeing their stock prices soar, and handing out massive executive compensation packages. Just one example. Lockheed Martin received $46 billion in unclassified federal contracts last year, returned $11 billion to shareholders through dividends and stock buybacks, and paid its CEO $25 million. These companies are fully reliant on the U.S. taxpayer, yet their CEOs make over 100 times more than the Secretary of Defense and 500% more than the average newly enlisted service member. If we're really looking at what true security is about, it means everything that we can do to improve the lives of ordinary Americans. True security is that we address the crisis of a declining life expectancy. The gap between the lifespan of the wealthy and the working class of this year is over 10 years. If you are working class in this country, you're going to die 10 years shorter than the wealthy. Is that not an issue of national security? Do we not want to make sure that all of our people, whether they're rich or poor or middle class, have the right to live full and productive and healthy lives? I think so. That's called national security. National security has to do with the issue of education for our kids. How are we secure if our young people, from childcare to graduate school, are not getting the quality of education? Madam President, there are millions of children who today in America, as we speak, are food insecure. There are days go by when they are hungry. How do we talk about national security and not talk about the crisis of childhood hunger, not to mention childhood poverty in general? How do we talk about national security when people are sleeping out on the street? How do we, in any sense of the word, talk about national security without understanding that the weather in Texas, in the Southwest, is now hitting record-breaking levels? People are dying from the heat. Oceans are getting hotter. We're looking at drought. We're looking at extreme weather disturbances in my own state. Just several weeks ago, the worst natural disaster, torrential rainfalls that we have had since 1927. That is national security, where the people get forced out of their homes because of flooding, die from heat stroke. That's called national security. This body, the Senate, could decide to have one or two fewer ballistic missile submarines, saving almost $15 billion over the next decade. And we could put that money, and we'll go a long way toward housing the homeless or feeding the 5 million children in this country who are food insecure. Instead, day after day, here in Washington, many of my colleagues tell the American people that we just don't have the money. We can't do what every other major country on earth does, guarantee health care to all people. Can't provide affordable housing, can't provide affordable child care, can't provide nutrition to kids in America who are hungry. We just can't afford to do any of those things. But come the military budget and all the lobbyists around here from the defense contractors, my God, we can't stop throwing money at them. So, Madam President, what I would say is that the time is long overdue for our country to get our national priorities right. And one small step forward would be to say no to this very bloated and wasteful military budget and start reordering our priorities so that we pay attention to the needs of the middle class and working class and low-income people rather than just defense contractors. And with that, Madam President, I yield.